So last week we rolled out the global vision statement, and this is the vision that we're going to be doing. We're going to be exploring all year long. Every month is dedicated to a different aspect of this vision. The title is The Global Vision. We see a world that works for everyone. And by the way, our beautiful Gloria Halverson has made about 40 copies that are out there on the table. So you are welcome to grab one when you leave to just be with it. And I'm not going to read it all through today, but just to give you a sense, it's a very optimistic vision. So it says things like where all life is honored as an expression of the divine, where forgiveness is the norm, where people have enough food, homes, and a sense of belonging, where there's peace, harmony, and justice for all, where resources are valued, cared for, and shared. So as you can see, it's just like this basic sense. Our whole theme is a heaven on earth. So in essence, we're describing a very utopian world. And I think one of the first things it can bring up in our mind is it realistic? Is this optimism Pollyannish? Is it sort of woo-woo? Is it like living in fantasy land? So I think one of the things we want to look at is what do we ultimately believe about this presence and this power that we call God, and we also call it infinitely good. And I actually think that infinite goodness is in all world's religions. It maybe not be as fleshed out as we have it. So traditionally in the Christian religion, God was good, but also there was hell and you'd burn in eternal flames, so that wasn't so good. I think the good part was that you had a choice and you could strive for heaven. The whole eternal flames. I remember my brother said to me, he said, if there's a God that had people in eternal hell, that's not a God I would ever choose to believe in, and I couldn't participate in that world. So I agree with that. So we've expanded it to saying, no, everybody, that God is good for everybody, that this wholeness and this goodness is in, through, and as all creation. There's no place where it stops and there's something else. So it's not a divisive power. It's not a power that's in fight with another power that's trying to beat it up and we're trying to win a war, the good and the evil. That ultimately, in the absolute, there's only good. There's only good. And this becomes really, really important on our spiritual journey because we don't always experience only good. This week, I share with some people, there's a whole nother thing I've been working on for the last 3 weeks outside of this community. But then within that paradigm of conflict and challenges, they had the tagline for the theme this week, because over 100 Centers for Spiritual Living are doing the same theme. And they used Ernest Holmes' quote, what was it? Where the need to learn from suffering, we don't need to learn from suffering anymore. And I just had to stop and say, well, wait a minute. Have we already gotten to that point where we don't need to suffer? Because I know a lot of people who are suffering, and so my concern is that it's like saying, well, if you're spiritually evolved, you'll stop suffering. And so I got a lot of emails back. And the theme of the emails back were, well, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Have you all heard that expression before? Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. So in essence, people can accept pain, but the suffering wasn't something that people embraced. And the reason why, I can understand the reason why, which is because in suffering, the concern is that people wallow in the pain. They start saying, I love this darkness, and there's some secondary feedback, payoff that you get from it. So for instance, when I worked in a psychiatric hospital, there were some people who didn't have much of a support system outside of the hospital. It was a very difficult world for them when they left. So what would happen is they would just keep coming back. They would do something so they would come back to the hospital, because in the hospital, you constantly had people asking you, how are you doing? Let me take care of you. Let me help you. And they were so nurtured and so loved that there was such a strong payoff to stay in that sort of victim identity, or I need help, because they weren't getting that out in the world. So that's the concern. That's why my colleagues have a concern around suffering, is that we start to get overly identified with being victims, and that we need people to take care of us. I think what Ernest Holmes meant, where, it's funny, I've been saying it all week, and now I can't remember the quote. Basically that we're done with suffering, learning from suffering. And It came from the world of the mythic theology, where there was a worship of suffering, where there was an ideal in the theology that we are inherently sinful, that we are inherently wrong, and that we need to, the way God loves us is by us constantly being so meek, I'm so bad, I'm a sinner, and the more I'm sinning and the more I'm suffering, the more love I'm going to get. And that's what he was saying. We're done with that. We can enjoy who we are. We're beautiful emanations of God, and we don't have to walk around saying I'm a sinner with our heads clenched, and we are made in the image and likeness of God. We're whole, we're beautiful, we're magnificent. Let's enjoy life. Let's not hold suffering on a pedestal. So in essence, what he was saying, let's not be attached to suffering. And this was the distinction I was trying to make, which is different than suffering, so I pointed out to them that I've been through suffering. And then someone wrote me back and said, well, that was when you were young. Like before, and I'm like, no, it happened within the last few years. It wasn't before I found spiritual principles, because I noticed that if we're spiritually evolved enough, we won't suffer anymore. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of my experience of suffering. So what can it look like authentically, where I don't think I was ever attached to it, where I wasn't putting it, and why it's not in of itself a bad thing. It's only when we get stuck or identified with it. So this has all been for the last 10 years. Some of you know most of the story. Some of you don't know it. So in 2005, I had a dream vision, and if you have a vision while you're dreaming, you know the difference, where we died, Jack, Julian, and I all died in a nuclear bomb. We were fine, and that actually was important to me, because in my head I realized subconsciously, I don't know if anyone else grew up with this fear of the nuclear war. And I noticed in my mind that I always thought, okay, God's more powerful than everything, but a nuclear bomb is even more powerful than God. And I knew I had that subtle belief. So it was good that I had this dream. So we were fine. Jack and Julian went off somewhere. And the I Am presence came and started, and it wasn't a form, it was no being. There's nothing visual, but I knew it was there. And we were reviewing my life on the planet, and it covered the whole earth. And it said, you're complete with all of that right now. You need to learn what they're teaching in Denver. And it really focused in. And these weren't words. You're in another state. And I knew what they were teaching was integral. Now, I had learned a little integral up until that point, and I liked what I learned, but I also thought it was way too heady, so I would have never continued on if it weren't for this vision. I wake up, and I'm like, oh, so that's what I'm totally supposed to be focusing on right now. So I did. I started reading the books and listening to all the DVDs and the CDs, and sort of immersed myself in learning this integral map, which is highly intellectual, but it brought a lot of clarity. Intellect isn't bad. Spirit uses all of us. And it brought a lot of clarity where I didn't even know that I needed it, and explained a lot of things. And then around 2010, and I taught it to other ministers, I taught it in community. And then around 2000, so that was about 5 years of just being immersed in it. About 2010, I had an interaction with this teacher who is clear as a sociopath. Just a quick hour-long conversation with him. His name's Mark Gaffney. And it was a great conversation, but it was twisted. But it wasn't just, so that was one thing that turned me off. And he was still being supported by the integral community. And just and I started noticing other teachers that were a little off in the integral community. And I was beginning to get confused, because here I had this extraordinary vision. And when you get a vision, you don't have to write it down because it's implanted in you. It's just like, and so that this was what I was supposed to learn, and I wasn't seeing it. I wasn't feeling the positivity coming from it. There's a lot of arguing and blah, blah, and people not treating each other well, and then but I still liked it, aspects of it. So then I went to an integral psychologist, because what was happening is I was beginning to get bored with everything. Nothing was feeding me. So I was concerned about it, and I thought, well, there's something in me that's split off. There's something wrong, and I got to find it. So I went to an integral psychologist just to find out what part of me is split off that I need to reintegrate. What have I denied in myself? And he did all these evaluations, 4-quadrant evaluations. It took 11 hours to fill that thing out. And then, well, I'm very verbal, so I can't put it all on him. But then I took this test, and it's supposed to assess where you are in your vertical development. And I just wanted to I said, I'm answering this from my lowest common denominator because I'm here not to try to impress, but I really want to find out what's wrong with me. So I'm answering the question, get the results back. And it took me like 3 times to read, because I was trying to find out what was wrong with me. And I'm like, well, wait, that's not, and I went back and read it again and read it again. And ultimately it was saying that I was testing at a very high level, which actually someone had scored my emails before and said the same thing, but I just didn't, I just blocked it out. And the reason why I say it's a very high thing, because I actually don't know what it is. Because in Integral, they have these levels of development, and I think most of us are at like this green, cultural, creative, and I don't pay attention. That's where I was arguing. I'm like, this other higher stuff I think is a bunch of baloney. So then they put me at the higher level. That's a way to shut them up. So then he was telling me, so this was his answer to me. He said, well, the reason why you're lonely and empty is because you're in this 4% bracket of evolution and people don't get you and blah, blah, blah. And I'm listening to him. I'm like, there's something very off here. This is not right. And I was clear. It wasn't a little. Let me just say, this was not false modesty. I was really clear, there's something really off here. Like, this is not right, because I know that I am not personally evolved, and I thought if you have a whole teaching that's telling people that they need to evolve to the place that I'm at, we are seriously screwed as a world. So you're heading them in the wrong direction. But what it did for me, so here I had this vision that I had to learn this map. I learned it, and I decided it was all a bunch of, mostly because not only about me, but all these weird teachers that they were talking about. I'm like, this can't be. So I got, I wouldn't say depressed. It was empty. It's the dark night of the soul. I had nothing. You know, I like New Thought, but I do need a little more complexity sometimes than New Thought gives. I do have that. To me, it's like playing basketball. Basketball is not an eternal thing, but it's something we enjoy doing. I like playing a little bit with my mind. But I knew it wasn't eternal, and I just felt empty, like I nothing. And here I am, I'm a minister, I have a son at home, we have bills to pay, and I'm supposed to stand up and speak about stuff, and I'm like, I don't know what to teach anymore. I don't know what I had no direction. I always was striving for something up until then. I wasn't even know what I was striving for anymore. I didn't really want anything. Not even really. I didn't want anything. So I just sort of was in that, and to me, that was suffering. That wasn't just pain. That was suffering because it was prolonged, and I didn't have an answer. You know, the thing that people say is why we don't need to suffer anymore is because we can choose differently. And I'm like, I didn't know what to choose. I was just sort of in this place of, I have nowhere to go. But here's the one thing I will say that I didn't do, is I didn't stop my spiritual practices. I kept up every day with my meditation, with my journaling, with my exercise, always staying with it, even though I didn't feel anything. Even the things that used to give me so much food were not giving me food anymore. I just kept at it because, and this is what goes back to our ultimate optimism, is because what I recognize is even though I had no clue what to do and didn't know what I stood for and didn't know where I was going, underneath all of that, I still absolutely felt to the depth of my being that God is infinitely good and God is infinitely loving. So whatever I don't know in that moment, there is still this goodness carrying me through it. So though I was suffering, I knew that was just a level. It was this too shall pass, yea, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that there was still something underneath it. And that's why I kept communing with it. That's why I kept at it, even though I didn't have any clue where I was going. And so this ultimately is going to be my invitation to all of us as we go through, not just this week, but as you really check in with your life as we go throughout this theme, this vision, which is very grandiose. How good is this God in my life? And that's where you always have to start, is with your own life. How good is this God? Like, when things are in the flow, it's easy to feel God is good. It's when things get a little challenging. Or if things are going well for me and I start looking at the news, I turn on the news and I hear all these other people who are going through enormous amount of pain. How good is this God really? And I think And I don't like easy answers. I don't like when people give me nice, easy answers to, well, of course God is good and this is just a temporary thing. I think this is something we have to know in the very depths of our being. That this optimism, that this is a beautiful, loving God, and that even though there are terrorists, even though there's incredible amounts of mass shootings and climate change and, just always these things that can constrict us, is there something underneath all of that is good? Is there something underneath? And to really find out, what do you really believe? Not just in your mind, but in your heart and in your soul. So what happened for me was I was journaling, and it's the funniest thing. The way I was talking about it is like, oh, and this guy came up and he gave me this book and it changed everything, which is true. But then I thought, people give me books all the time, and they make book recommendations. So it wasn't just that someone out of the blue gave me a book. I was ready for it. I was sitting in the Starbucks, 5:30 in the morning, when I like to journal. As most of you know, I journal to my beloved. And I'm sitting there writing, and this gentleman who works with the homeless came over and said, here, I just thought you would like this book. I see him in there for 8 years. He's never given me anything. He came over, and it was the Brother Lawrence book, Practicing the Presence. I've talked about Brother Lawrence in my talks. I knew who he was, but I never actually read the book. And I started reading it, and went to become a monk. They put him in a kitchen, and that's all he did, was work in a kitchen and pray. And he was so simple. He just loved God. He just prayed, and and his goal was to pray 24 hours a day. So not just do spiritual practices, but it was all-consuming, and he was so forgiving. We see the picture we see of monks all the time is they're beating themselves up for not being good enough. He was so clear he was forgiven. At the end of every day, he said, for all the times I messed up, I knew I was forgiven, and just started fresh the next day. He knew it. He knew he was loved, and he knew he can make mistakes every single day. It didn't stop him. Pray and pray. He was beautiful, and you could feel it. And people started coming to him for spiritual. Here's this kitchen guy, and the reason why they put him in there is because he wasn't ready for the higher positions, and yet people started coming to him because they felt this pull. But it's a small book, and I was sitting there in Starbucks reading it, and it's like being given a starving person a crumb. It's really good, but I know it's going to end. So I'm praying as I'm reading it. I'm like, what am I going to do when this book is over? It's like I'm holding on to it so tightly in this moment. And of course, someone else comes over to me and says, hey, there's this book I'd love you to read. And this book is about the monks of Mount Athos, Greek Orthodox monks. I actually knew about Greek Orthodox. It's one of the things you study in ministerial school. Theology never did anything for me. It's like any Orthodox theology. I find it a little bit limiting and constricting. Normally, I would have just said thank you and just put it in my bookshelf, and that would have been that. But I was so hungry that I just started reading it. And I've asked other people to read it, and they don't get as excited. And I recognize the first half of the book is very basic. Be kind, be patient. You don't go, oh, wow, that's a new thought. I should be kind. So people don't get very far. But I was hungry, so I was reading it. And by the last third of this book, these monks, I completely was in love. Not only was I in love with them, it was the first time I felt at home. It was the first time I said, this is it. This is what I've been looking for my entire life. Gentle, kind, humble, radiate light. They were just pure, and they weren't pure like in their head, like their whole being. And there was a power that radiated from their gentleness. And so I'm reading this, and I'm like, oh, that's it. This is what I want to do. And so suddenly that moment of suffering that I've been going through just shifted. And my ministry started shifting, and it's been ever since, like how to integrate that plus New Thought plus Integral, so I'm still working on how to integrate it all. But by continuing on during that suffering, by continuing to make myself available, both of these books came to me while I was journaling to God. That to continue in the process, even when I was in pain, even when I felt completely lost, when I felt abandoned by spirit. I mean, that's a big part of the dark night of the soul, is you feel like God has abandoned you. But to keep at it, to believe underneath, even if I'm going through that experience, underneath, I know this is going to lead me to something better. I know it, even though I can't feel it, I can't see it, I'm blind to it. I know this presence is good. And that's ultimately how I feel about suffering. I don't think we're done with suffering. I think it's part of the human condition. But I don't think we want to hang out in suffering. We don't want to elevate it. I'm not going to go seek out suffering again because, oh, look what good things came from that. I think I'll go be miserable again. No, I don't want to do that. What's interesting about these monks, this is my last point. It's given me a lot to think about. Because the monks have the theology which I was sort of making fun of at the beginning. Their main prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I cannot bring myself to say that, I'm a sinner. I just won't do it. But they're full of, I'm a sinner. We're bad people. We were born and so they had this really limited theology. At the same time, I found more light in them than I found. I'm like, when I was reading them, the thought that I kept having as I was reading about them, I'm like, this is what we're talking about in New Thought, but they're actually living it. They actually are gentle. They actually are radiate all light. And so it toyed with me for a while. Like, how can you have a philosophy that's so negative, and it still feels negative? I'm not saying I've changed on that for me, but how can you have a philosophy that's so negative that the result is so full of light? Do you want to know? All right, let's pray out. Because they weren't afraid of the darkness within them. The way we look at darkness, I think sometimes, so we say, I absolutely believe that we can get to a place, heaven in my mind is all light. I believe we can move into heaven where our experiences are primarily, but it has to be a vibrational frequency. We move up in vibrational frequency where it's all light. And that's important because the way we look at human world is its duality. It goes back and forth between the dark and the light. And I think the way often we can see moving into light is pushing the darkness away. And what I've discovered is that doesn't work. That we can get more light. By focusing on just the light, we can get more light. I don't say that doesn't work. It absolutely works. But only to a point. In the Jedi warriors, they're not looking to get rid of the darkness. They want a balance. They always talk about a balance. They're not trying to get rid of the darkness. What I think the monks do is they transform the darkness, that in the midst of the darkness is the light. That in fact there is no real darkness. The illusion is that darkness is real. And that's why we have to push it away. So if we're only wanting to be light and we're pushing the darkness away, that's because we actually believe there's darkness. What these monks became masters in, and I learned this more from reading about the Desert Fathers who were writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and the 4th and 5th too, is they knew their own inner darkness so well. As I read them, I'm like, oh man, Freud has nothing in them. They knew every nuance of darkness. And because they had faced it so profoundly in them, they were fearless of it. They had no fear around darkness, their own darkness or other people's. And that's the part that surprised me. That's the part I thought, why do they spend so much time in this darkness? It's depressing. But the darkness never owned them. They always knew, for them it was Jesus the Christ. We can say it's the divine infinite self. They always knew the light was more powerful. They always knew that there is something deep, that's the optimism that I've discovered at the heart of all of this. That underneath, whatever this darkness is saying, I need to feel better than people, or I feel worse than people, or I need to dominate people, or I need to hide from people. Whatever those things that show up. I need to control people. I'm afraid of being controlled. The whole back and forth that we do, the ego play. They were aware of all of it. And they gave it, every bit of it, over into the divine. And they were meticulous, because they were monks. They weren't doing much else. That's not true. They were building these ginormous monasteries. They were hard at work. But they were constantly in this prayer praying all day was the key for them. That was the pray all day. So no matter what's arising, I'm going to keep giving it over to the light. I'm going to keep giving. I don't pretend it's not there. I've talked before about this whole thing with Mark Gaffney, but even what he represents are spiritual teachers that are off. we are more susceptible to teachers who will manipulate us, spiritual teachers, if we don't know our own darkness. Because what I see is that people can't believe the darkness that's within him. I remember Andrew Harvey had this horrible experience with Mother Mira, who gave him these great mystical experiences, and then she turned on him. And then he would, and I didn't believe him. I remember he was in a workshop, and he was talking about how all her followers were putting all this dark energy on him, and he had to hide and go. And I'm like, people are not that nuts. And I'm discovering more and more, wow, there's a lot of dark energy out there. If we don't see it, we can't hold the truth for it. If we're always walking around in this ooh, everything's good, we're actually not being a profound warriors for light in this world. We want to be in the other world. We want to be in another world where isn't this darkness. But I think as long as we're here on this earth, we need to be warriors for light in the midst of the darkness, and we have to be it with ourselves first. It is impossible to be with anyone else's darkness or any darkness out there if we cannot be with our own darkness. And that darkness doesn't go away. Doesn't just arise in crisis. I find people will deal with their darkness if it's just a big moment. But it's a daily thing, and that's the thing. I don't believe in saying I'm a sinner, but what they were saying in that idea of I'm a sinner is I am limited. As a human being, I'm always limited. There's always a part of me that isn't enough. And we don't get to walk away from that. It's not our absolute identity, but it's a part of being human. And that was what I think a sinner, for them, that's how I interpret it anyways, to make it palatable, is that I'm limited. And by acknowledging that on a consistent basis, it opens and softens our heart. I think the reason why I resist so much, I'm wonderful and I'm whole and I'm perfect and I'm complete and I'm the light of God, all of that is great. And I think the reason why I want to integrate what they're bringing is because I also feel there's a hardness to it. They're like, I have to know that I'm wonderful. I have to know that I am made in the image of God and light. But what I find is when I also own my limitations, my heart softens in a way when I'm honoring my greatness doesn't. Somehow I become a kinder human being when I recognize my limitations. I become a more compassionate human being when I recognize that I am of myself pretty limited, that I don't have the strength to change my life and make it perfect of myself. And there's something sweet in that. There's something kind in that. And I think when we have this idea of optimism, it doesn't have to be this, I'm so excited. It can be this deep, peace-filled, joy-filled, love-filled, sweet, gentle knowing that is a real power of light and of goodness and of optimism that doesn't always need to announce itself. I think it's fun to get up and shout and play too, but it's all of it. And I think what we're looking for is to make everything light, that to go into the darkness and know even in the darkness is incredible light, our incredible treasures, our incredible gifts that we can't find if we just hang out in the light. It's got to all be light. If we're going to become heaven on earth, every aspect of earth has to become light. And that's only going to happen through us. So my invitation this week is first and foremost, be honest. Now, if we want to just really see, where is my heart? Feel into your heart and into your body. Do I really believe when I'm going through challenging situations, whether it's now or I have in the past, do I really believe there is something good underneath that? Do I really believe that? Do I really believe that ultimately my life is being guided by something that really does love me and really wants nothing but good for me? And as I know that about my life, do I really believe that about this world as we turn on the news? Can I watch the news and say, underneath all of this darkness, there is a light? Do I really believe that? Because we need to really believe that if we're going to create heaven on earth. Because it's that light, that belief that's going to carry us through those times of darkness so we don't get stuck in the wallowing of the suffering, but that light will carry us through and transform that very darkness and make it something that it never knew it was. They say at the deepest darkness is our greatest star. is our greatest treasure. So how y'all feeling about that? Optimistic. Are you willing to explore for yourself about how optimistic you feel about the world? Thank you. And I would take more credit, except for we're all creating this talk together, because I always ask. And two, I think suffering is a part of all of our experience. I mean, at one point, and I think we're all suffering because it's just cloudy every day. I was thinking about that just on a very basic level. I come from Cleveland, which is like the cloudiest city in the universe. And I didn't even notice it. It was just, it was normal. But I've come out here and I've gotten used to so much light that when the darkness comes, I'm like, okay, I can take a day or two, but let's get back to the light. I'm done. I don't mind if it's raining because at least it's doing something useful, but the clouds don't feel useful to me at all. You're not being useful, go away. So anyway, I do think it does strike me that I'm like, wow, we get used to a certain amount of light, but if you're living in clouds all the time, that becomes the norm. It's interesting. Oh, you'll be getting, it's going to be a signed reading for you. I'm not telling you guys because it's going to be... It's a different book, same author, yeah. And about the same monks. These monks, by the way, I think I might have mentioned, the island, they get all the Pew Research is saying how everybody's leaving churches and religion. They get 400,000 pilgrims a year. And they're like, nobody even knows they exist. And yet this little island away from everything, it's really hard to get to. Only men, by the way. 400,000. There's something going on there that's drawing all these people there. All that prayer actually has an impact. What?
Women can visit, they're just not monks.
Women, I don't think women can visit. Only men can visit. The what? I don't want to. Oh.
What about that bus? You know that bus of all the nuns that went to...
Oh, well, they have. I think they have a women's. Wait, I don't know. Are you sure was that not the monastery and whatever? We'll talk about it. We'll explore. It's a good thing to explore. But here's the point: they don't need to go to Mount Athos because they can just come to the lighthouse. We are it now. Thank you. That's why, and I'm just feeling so much joy about being here this morning. I know who you are, and it's awesome. But you're also limited. No, I'm kidding. Just like me. All right.